Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 84 of the Ask Historians podcast, where today we're going to be talking about the Salem Witch Trials, and particularly what we would call a digital humanities approach to the Salem Witch Trials. We'll explain what that means in the episode itself, but for now, let's go ahead and do, it's the first podcast of the month, so let's go ahead and do our book giveaway to our Patreon subscribers. So as always, if you support us on Patreon at patreon.com/AskHistorians, you get entered into the book giveaway, and greater levels of support get greater numbers of quote-unquote tickets to get it. We offer a selection of 4 books, to which the winner gets to pick one. So our selection of 4 books this week, or this month, I should say, the first one is Emerson W. Baker's A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience, recommended by our guest today. We also have Robert K. Massey's Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the Winning of the Great War at Sea. That's recommended by user The Fourth Man in the Boat. We also have Sawande M. Mustakim's Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage. He's actually just recently did a AMA on the main sub for us. You can go look that up. I'll put it in the discussion notes. The discussion post that we do. And finally, we have my recommendation this month, which is Susan Kellogg's Weaving the Past, A History of Latin America's Indigenous Women from Pre-Hispanic to Colonial Times. So those are the 4 we have offered as a selection today, and our lucky winner, we get to pick one of them. And our lucky winner today is Michael Moore, presumably not the filmmaker, and presumably not the first time someone has made that joke. So Michael, I'll be contacting you through the email account that you have listed for your Patreon account, and we'll arrange getting your whichever one of those books you want shipped to you. But in the meantime, so we're going to go back, and now we're going to get into the episode where we again be talking about the Salem Witch Trial, particularly looking at kind of, I guess, a more modern, technologically driven, quantitative approach to understanding this kind of complex web of psychosis and as we'll see, kind of just generally kind of political rivalry as well. It's an interesting episode, so I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask Historians. Today, we're going to be speaking about the Salem Witch Trials, and also a particular kind of approach to examining this kind of well-known phenomena in American history. Why don't we go ahead and let our guest today introduce himself and let us know about what got you interested in this topic and this approach to it.
Hello, my name's Dan Howlett. I'm a senior at George Washington University. In the fall, I will be going to George Mason University for a master's program. And I've been studying the Salem Witch Trial since I was a junior in high school. And 3 years ago at GW, I started a social network analysis of the trials. And that has become my mini obsession and my soon-to-be thesis website.
And was there something in particular that drew you to the Salem Witch Trials?
So it turns out that I'm actually descended from the accusing side of the trials. The Putnams, who are considered the bad guys of it, by most accounts, are the ones that started all the accusations, and I'm very closely connected to all of them.
So you're descended from a long line of illustrious witch hunters.
Yes.
And so what's the particular approach that you're taking about this? Because I think we're going to be spending a little more time actually talking about, I guess we'd say, kind of the techniques of historical research than kind of the witch trials themselves.
I am creating a social network analysis of the trials. So what that means is, rather than just talking about what the primary sources say, I'm graphing all the interactions that the documents reference. So I go through and I read transcript of a document, and it says that Ann Putnam Jr. accused Sarah Good of witchcraft. So it means Ann Putnam Jr. and Sarah Good have some type of relationship there. I can define what that means later on. But I then graph that for everyone who's involved in the trials. And in the court documents alone, there's over 1,400 people with almost 10,000 unique relationships.
Well, before we delve, I think, into the details of this, why don't we go ahead and just, because I'm sure a lot of people are familiar, at least kind of passingly familiar with the Salem trials, but go ahead and give us kind of the the quick rundown of when they happened, why they happened. Well, I guess the why is a little more difficult, but at least the when and the what.
In 1692, a number of things occurred. There were a lot of massive and complex events going on that created a lot of uncertainty in the colony. There were the Indian Wars going on the main frontier. There was a lot of tension in Salem between Salem Village and Salem Town and within Salem Village itself. And the political stability of the colony was threatened by events happening in the 1680s. So a lot of things kind of break the camel's back here. Really, any one event could have caused a smaller outbreak of witchcraft accusations, in my opinion. But all of these things happen at the same time, so we see a lot of trends that really allow the witch trials to spiral out of control and affect so many people at one time. And it results in 19 people being hanged, 1 person pressed to death. There are 5 that we know of who died in jail, and there were about 150 people arrested in total. A few more dozen were accused but never arrested. But this involved a wide area of Massachusetts. It went as far as York, Maine, as it's known now today, and it went as far south as the Boston area, too. So it's not just Salem when we're talking about the Salem Witch Trials.
Salem, of course, was, I guess, kind of the epicenter of the trials themselves, though.
Yes, it starts in what was called Salem Village, which is now Danvers, Massachusetts. And it had a lot to do with tension between Salem Village wanting to separate and become independent from Salem Town, which is modern-day Salem for the most part.
So, I mean, what were the kind of key, I guess you could say, I mean, why did Salem Village want to be separate from Salem Town? Was there a particular bad blood or economic differences?
There's some economic differences. Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum talk a lot about those differences, since Salem Village was somewhat more agricultural and Salem Town was starting to expand and be a little bit more of a port city. There's some dispute over whether or not that's entirely accurate, and separating an agricultural community and the commercial city is a little difficult since they were both dependent on each other as well. But that's part of it. It's also the fact that people from Salem Village need to go to Salem Town for any official business, for church meetings, and it's a long distance. It's at least a 5-mile walk for a lot of these people, if not further. So a lot of people just want their own meeting house, their own community, since they were fairly separate, just geographically speaking.
Yeah, and were there kind of, I guess you could say, since we're going to be looking at social networks, were there kind of, non-overlapping social networks in these areas? Were people in Salem Village kind of set apart from the people in Salem Town kind of socially as well?
Socially, it did start to look like that just based on where you lived. They knew a lot of people in the other communities since there was a lot of interaction for just local politics and commercial interest. But they did form very distinct communities with their towns. Like politically, Salem Village was in a very different spot than Salem Town. And with things like the Indian Wars going on, people from Salem Village had to go defend Salem Town. They served as the watchkeepers for that, and they would travel there. So they'd travel further south than where they lived to make sure that area was defended rather than staying with their own homes. And this is just one of the things that really adds tension between the community.
Well, let's talk actually about building kind of a social network model. So you kind of briefly touched about going through, old court records and things like that, but give us a little insight into how one, kind of the theory behind social network theory and kind of the more particulars about how you built your model.
Social network theory is the idea that within a social network, all the interactions that occur have some matter of importance, and they form larger groups within that network. So when I'm graphing people, what I'm doing is I'm taking the transcriptions of the court records, which fortunately are all published, and I'm going through and finding all the names in all these documents, and every time there's a pair of names and there's some reason to believe there was an interaction or some type of relationship there, I'm putting that in an Excel spreadsheet, and I have all these pairs of names, and I end up graphing that. And the definition of relationship can change depending on how the historian doing the work wants to define it. So I have my own definition of relationships, which I explain when I talk about my project for and I define it as just any interaction that occurs. And I end up graphing that through a program called NodeXL, which creates images of these social networks, and all these pairs of names end up showing up on it, and they end up grouping as well. The program has an algorithm that groups it by clusters, and these clusters are grouped without my involvement at all. I don't know what the algorithm decides to do when it makes these clusters, but then I look at the names and figure out, okay, here's why these people are probably grouped together, and it allows me to do more historical analysis that way.
So it's taking kind of a quantitative approach from the start, and then applying more qualitative kind of reasoning and assessments to it.
Yeah, the way my professor who's advising me on this project and I define it for digital humanities as a whole is taking a subject that really is not normally quantitative and making it that. So even though I'm not a math person by any means, I've now taken history and added math to it.
Oh, always a dangerous proposition. But when we're looking through these court records, or I guess when you're looking through these court records, and we're seeing these people and their names pop up again and again, are we seeing kind of particularly important nodes that you're finding, people who are more connected than the rest?
Yes, absolutely. Each node on my graph represents a person, and the average for the nodes, there's generally about 13.5 connections per node, which is just the average from the 1,400 that I have on there. The maximum is 260. So that's well above the average. So there are some people who have hundreds of connections when most people barely break 10.
And who are we seeing that are having these major connections then?
It's mostly the judges. So Judge Hawthorne, Judge Corwin have a lot of connections, and Putnam Jr., who accused more people than anyone else has it. And then there's a few suspects who have people petitioning on their behalf that end up getting a lot of connections, like Rebecca Nurse, the Proctors, and Mary Bradbury.
Well, let's break that down a little bit. I think the reason that the judges might be mentioned more often is probably kind of obvious, since they, of course, were the judges of the trials. But what about, well, let's start with Ann Putnam then. Clearly she was, she's going to be mentioned more because she was doing all the accusations. But I mean, is there a particular reason that, because she was a child, right? Is there a particular reason that she is so kind of the focal point of where all these accusations are stemming from?
Yeah. One of the great things about this project is I can then take different case files out of the master network that I've created and look at individual cases. And I can also do that with groups of cases. So in May, the attorney for the colony, Thomas Newton, requested 8 suspects that he wanted transferred to Salem to start the trials. And I've graphed those 8 cases just to look at why these people. Because we know he's thinking strategically about how to get these convictions and how to continue his own job as the attorney for these cases. And when you graph those 8 cases, it ends up that Ann Putnam Jr. is the most powerful person in that network. Because what's going on is her father, Thomas Putnam, he's one of the Salem Village independence movement leaders. He's involved in a lot of the politics with the Salem Village Church. He's well known in the community. He's really taking his influence and acting through his daughter, in my opinion. There are some people out there who think that this was all premeditated by Thomas Putnam. I don't believe that at all. I think Thomas Putnam has presented this opportunity. There are young girls in the community who suffer what is called witchcraft afflictions, and he then is able to get his daughter to make similar accusations. Whether or not he's directly suggesting names, his daughter is probably well aware of people that he does not like and wants named. So she's at the very least pleasing her father, and directly or indirectly, it doesn't really make a difference at this point. But those are the cases that are the ones that the colony sees as the likely convictions, just because of how influential the Putnam family is throughout this entire event.
Well, I want to touch back on the Putnam's influence and who they were accusing, or I guess who Anne was accusing. But just to briefly kind of touch on something you mentioned there, witchcraft afflictions. What counts as a witchcraft affliction?
Really, if the doctor goes through his medical books and can't find a disease to call it, he will end up calling it witchcraft of some sort. So what's happening in 1692 is these young girls are falling into trances. They're barking like dogs. They're shouting at invisible specters. They're running around. There's reports of one girl running into a fireplace and grabbing burning embers and throwing them around. Others just running around the room, flapping their arms, going wish, wish. And it's just all this behavior that these young girls should not be doing in a Puritan community.
So it's just kind of bizarre, a kind of constellation of bizarre behaviors.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the people that Ann Putnam is accusing, I mean, are we particularly seeing that these are actually kind of falling in primarily political rivals of her father, or children of the political rivals of her father then?
It does end up that a lot of political rivals of her father are accused. Not the direct rivals. The main Putnam beef at the time is with the Porter family. The Porters are the wealthiest family in Salem, so they never get accused. It's very hard to accuse them. But a lot of friends of theirs are accused. Like Rebecca Nurse is accused in Salem Village. The Porters lead a very large and strong movement to try to defend her, which ends up failing. But the Nurse family is a political ally of the Porters, and the Putnams end up accusing them. So, in my opinion, it's no coincidence that Rebecca Nurse is one of the ones chosen. I think a lot of this is all political. But then there's other suspects like Sarah Osborne, who the Putnams were in legal battles with. Sarah Good, there's other reasons to accuse. She was a beggar at the time, and Thomas Putnam was recently involved in the petition to Salem town to separate a little bit from and form their own two communities by starting to take care of their own poor in Salem Village, which was common at the time. The town would end up paying for the poor. And it just happens that they accuse a beggar, a woman that they're in legal battles with. And then the third person who's accused on the first day is Tituba, which is a slave in the Paris household that the Paris family owns, and the Parises are big allies of the Putnams. So it's very coincidental that all three who are accused on the first day are very convenient for Thomas Putnam.
So in the long run, I guess you could say, let's break it down a little bit. In the beginning, are we really kind of seeing the majority of all the people who were accused being kind of on the bad side of the Putnams? And in the long run, how many people who were accused in totality were, these rivals of the Putnams, kind of politically and socially?
A lot of the accused from the Salem area were rivals of the Putnams, but not a majority of those accused in total, because what ends up happening is other towns start to realize what's going on in Salem, and people start realizing that this works, and more people start accusing others. So it starts to shift in the summer of 1692 from being a very Salem-centric event to Andover, Massachusetts, where there were actually more people accused. And it really does show a lot of political tension whenever you look at a single accusation. Collectively, all the accused suspects are not really a majority of any political enemies of anyone. But it does work out that if you look at one accusation, those accusing them are the political opponents of the other side.
So do we see other major kind of groupings and nodes of, I guess you'd say, accusers, other than, centered around Ann Putnam? Are there other, I could say, super accusers?
There's a few others. There's a big difference between the Andover accusers and the Salem accusers. If we look at just the eigenvector scores, which means the power rankings of those involved in the witch trials, which is really just how important is the node in that represents you, and looking at who that node is connected to, the eigenvector score really just says, here's who's important in the network. That's the simplest way to explain it. And it's the Salem accusers who are generally in the top. The Andover accusers never really reach that level. But what we do end up seeing is that a lot of the Andover accused suspects get tied to the Salem accused suspects. Because when they're making these accusations, they realize who is important to accuse, but who do we need to connect them to? Because they're saying, oh, I see the specter of this person, which just means they see the image of this person, and the real person's probably miles away. But if they're claiming to see the specter, which is something a witch can send their own image to afflict others, and they say, oh, I see the specter of Samuel Wardwell, who's one of the Andover witches, and they connect him to one of the other suspects from Salem, they're really just connecting the Andover and Salem trials, even though they're in their own way two separate events.
So we're basically having this kind of second round of accusations kind of referencing and calling back people who were accused in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah. So when, what were the connections between Salem and Andover at this point? I mean, were these two closely related towns, or was it just this kind of Andover, kind of picking up and I guess kind of replicating what was going on in Salem then?
They are neighboring towns. Some of the Salem girls were brought into Andover to look at lineups of women basically and say, are any of these people who afflicted you, and point at them. So they are connecting these two towns just through the accusations. But these two towns are also on what was then the frontier, really. And they're both suffering what Mary Beth Norton calls in her book, In the Devil's Snare, basically war paranoia and fear of Indian attacks. This fear really does control the entire region at the time. And if you look at the Andover accusations, there's a lot of references to the frontier. And that is really what's driving the Andover accusations. So it's picking up on all these fears that were referenced in Salem, but those fears take a much stronger hold in Andover in the accusations, and it's much less about local politics in a lot of them.
So this kind of goes back to what you're saying about there were a number of factors going at the time, any which could end up leading to the straw being the camel's breaking the camel's back. In this case, just kind of this general sense of it sounds like paranoia in the region.
Yes, if you look at the work by Emerson Baker and Mary Beth Norton, their main focus is the main frontier and the fear coming from Indian raids, because a lot of people do believe that Andover is one of the next towns that will be attacked, that Salem will be attacked soon, because there's not many communities left up in Maine. A lot of these towns have been razed, and a lot of refugees are fleeing into the Salem area, and some of the accusing girls are from that region.
The Salem Witch Trials have been studied pretty extensively. What's the advantage of doing, say, this kind of more quantitative approach to understanding them rather than some of the approaches that I've done in the past?
The big difference is we haven't had this technology to do it before. Social network analysis is still very new. A lot of historians haven't even started to use it. There's a few projects out there that kind of break into this realm of digital humanities for these subjects. Not really anything colonial America yet. But what we do have the benefit of is that there's a lot of information in the Salem Witch Trial, so it's really hard to understand it just reading through. There's a lot going on. And recently, some historians have criticized Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum's book, Salem Possessed, for making a lot of statements that aren't entirely backed up by some of the evidence. They do go off and claim that there's a lot of involvement with the tax records from Salem at the time, and that has just been discredited. There's an entire issue of the William and Mary Quarterly that goes back and reconsiders Boyer and Nissenbaum's work, and basically they recanted a lot of it. But what one article in that says is by Richard Latner, and he says Boyer and Nissenbaum have a good argument, but it will take a new type of thesis to really explain that and prove it. And I think social network analysis is that new type of thesis that will prove it.
So looking more kind of at saying, the more, I guess you say, mundane connections between people, rather than looking to explanations of kind of psychological explanations, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I've given myself a blessing or a curse, but in theory, every node on my graph and every relationship between those nodes could be its own small article. So there's a lot of work I can do here. It's just a matter of how much will I actually be able to do.
Well, I mean, and how much are you drawing upon these kind of like, past, interpretations? Because I know when it comes down to it, you're building these nodes, you're building these networks, and then you're kind of more, qualitatively looking at it and saying, okay, well, we see the connections between, this person and all these other people, and then breaking it down by what does that mean? So how much are you really kind of drawing upon these past explanations of, say, social rivalry like we've talked about, or, psychological hysteria and things like that?
I start out by just looking at the graph and even just removing the label, so I don't even know which node is representing which person. Because just looking at the graph, I can see where are people connected and who is the important connections to look at. And then once I look at the assigned name, I can then take all the theories that are from the past, really centuries, from historians, and start trying to define what I'm seeing visually with what we've already assessed from a lot of the historical record that we have. And I can start interpreting the social network through some of these lenses by saying, okay, here's all the people who are involved on the main frontier. Here's all the people who are involved in Salem Village politics, and start looking at all these nodes and seeing who are they connected to. Is it really the main frontier that's their main influence, or are they in a network that's more politically active?
And I think the other thing, kind of the other factor of the people who are being accused here that we haven't really touched on yet, is the fact that, most people know that the majority of the accused and the majority of the executed were women. Does that have significance? Does that get picked up, and is that shown in the approach that you're using?
There are a lot of women who are accused. There are some men too, which often surprises people. One of the interesting things about this network is just how powerful some women end up in the social network. Because socially, women were not the most prominent individuals. They weren't allowed to be. They didn't have as much power. But then when I look at the network where I just take Thomas Newton's letter and look at the 8 case files that he requested first, and I see that a 12-year-old girl is the most important person in that network, that's really flipping the social structure of really any Puritan community. There shouldn't be a 12-year-old girl who's the most influential person. So we start to see how women are really involved when you look at it at a more quantitative way, because there's a lot of influences there, because it's women who are connected to other people as well. Women are the ones who are taking care of the home, but that means when people visit the house, that's who they interact with. And there's a lot of connections that we start to see when we just look at who's interacting with who. And the role of women at that time was very important. So we start to see a very different view of just social interaction.
So it's kind of the approach that, or at least it's an approach that shows how social life was functioning at that time. Something that doesn't often get captured necessarily in kind of the, I guess you'd say, the official documents and the official histories, which tend to focus on, the, I guess you could say, the patriarchal community leaders of the church and state.
Yes, it's basically going through and looking to see who was in the room when it happened. And a lot of the time, even if they aren't as actively involved, there's a lot of women who are there and are present and are taking part of it in some way, but it just might not appear that they're as active as the men.
Well, I also want to kind of, start to build us towards a little of an epilogue here. And I kind of want to have a two-part epilogue where I ask you about, significance of digital humanities in a bit. But first, I kind of want to ask you, why is Salem so significant? It was, because it all took place in the course of over, like a year? In some colonies up in some small towns up in Massachusetts. And even though, it spread very widely, but why does everyone know Salem as opposed to any of the other events that have happened in kind of, America's early history?
When the witch trials occurred, it starts in winter of 1692 and it's all over by May 1693. So it's roughly not even 18 months. Yet so many historians have looked at it that a lot of historians think it's not even worth going back and studying it now because there's nothing new we can do there. We've covered it so much at this point. But it's one of those things that really has not been fully explained. No one really knows why this happened. We don't know what caused the girls to be afflicted with witchcraft. We don't know if it was some type of disease, a mental health disorder. We know that it was not ergot poisoning, but we don't know what caused that. What we do know is what people were doing as individuals and how they were acting and manipulating the situation. But that's one of those things where we have so many questions still about what caused it, and there's so many people involved that we can keep looking at it at new angles, that the story of it itself just really captures your attention, because you're talking about witchcraft and people who truly believe there were witches there, and they're talking about the devil coming and visiting them, and they're talking about how witches would take you. And one girl, Mercy Lewis, says George Burroughs carried me up to a high mountain, threatened to throw me off if I didn't sign the devil's book. So even without the historical aspect of it and the analysis, there's a narrative there that just makes for a great story that's fascinating. So I don't think like TV shows like Salem or Arthur Miller's The Crucible don't even need to add the fictional parts that they do. The story itself is an amazing tale.
So it's just a good mystery to begin with lots of little spooky supernatural elements.
Yeah.
So I guess the other kind of epilogue I want to ask here is this is of course you've mentioned a couple times digital humanities. So I mean for the listeners who aren't familiar with the term, then which for this podcast I think most are, but what are digital humanities, and what's their significance?
Digital humanities is a new field that's growing in history, and it's taking subjects like history, English, philosophy, any of the traditional humanities, and adding technology to them and starting to integrate it into the digital world that we have now. Because there are so many great tools that we have that we should be using them. And the fact that we haven't fully integrated some subjects into this new world is a little sad. It's a little disappointing that a lot of professors out there still think we should keep the traditional, sit in a room with a book and paper and write your own analysis based on that. But we have so many tools that we can find new interpretations and ways to make old subjects like the Salem Witch Trials new again.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us on the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you all so much for listening, and a big thanks to our Patreon supporters. If you want to get down on supporting the podcast and also getting entered into our book giveaways, you can do that by going to patreon.com/AskHistorians. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, just share it with other people. Tell your friends, tell your lovers in the night, tell your professors. If your professor is your lover in the night, consider that you're making poor choices and that you're causing a lot of academic conflict. But until then, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you'll continue to come back and enjoy the show and peruse through our back catalog. If this is the first one you've heard, I recommend starting from the newer episodes and working your way back. Regardless, I hope you kind of enjoyed this episode and got a kind of a peek into kind of more of the focusing on the kind of methodology of doing history. There's digital humanities. It's not new, of course. This is something that's going on for. I mean, I guess if you probably. Actually, it's probably a good question to see how long the kind of term digital humanities has been around, and I would say probably people have been using new forms of technology to do historical research since humanity first started writing down history with that newfangled technology called writing. But it's an interesting approach to kind of take these more kind of computer data driven quantitative approaches to teasing apart the massive amounts of data that we can have in certain historical records, particularly something as when you get into kind of, I guess you'd say, legal history, which the Salem Witch Trials most particularly are. You generate reams and reams and reams of paper, and it can be a little difficult to kind of parse through it all. So legal history is absolutely one of those areas that something like this kind of quantitative approach to kind of just sorting out the data can be particularly helpful. People always think of, again, as we kind of discussed at the end there, people always think of historians as someone, sitting in a dusty room filled with dusty books, wearing a tweed jacket and smoking a pipe, and then coming up with very thoughtful things about the past, kind of stemming from their own, kind of philosophy of mind. But in reality, it involves a lot of it does involve a lot of dusty books, but it also involves a lot of kind of innovative approaches to the field. So just hope that was made abundantly clear in the episode today that there's always new fields and new approaches you can take to even, I guess, very well studied questions of history, like the Salem Witch Trials. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. Our host, Andres, will be coming back and doing his second turn as the host. So I hope you give him a warm welcome back. Until then, of course, if you like the show, feel free to tell everyone you know. If you don't like the show, don't tell anyone at all. You can share us on social media, etc., etc. Rate and review us on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you happen to listen to your podcasts or get them from. We're on any number of streaming things. We're on SoundCloud. I got really good about uploading things to our YouTube page for a while, and then I kind of got lazy about that. So I promise I'll get back to that again. I think we've got about the first 30 episodes maybe on there, or maybe about 15 or so episodes. Anyway, we've got several episodes up on there, and I promise I'll get back to that. But until then, hope you enjoyed the show, and again, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.